cop who put his badge on the line for justice.
You know the name Doug Poppa?
Yes, I do. God bless Doug Poppa, an honest cop.
I was elated, of course, but then as he testified, I was somewhat concerned for him, because I knew that they were probably going to crucify that man.
Sometimes the truth has a price. That may be the lesson of a Virginia police officer who says, in trying to do the right thing, he ended up paying for it.
The message you're sending is, see, we did it, Doug. You don't come out, you don't buck the system. No matter what the reason is, you just can basically keep your mouth shut. But if I wouldn't do it all over again, I would take the badge and I would leave it on somebody's desk and get out of police work. Because the day I can't tell the truth because somebody's pressuring me, and the day the system doesn't want me to tell the truth because somebody's pressuring me, is the day I'd leave the badge on the desk and walk away.
Poppa was fired for insubordination. One man who confronted truth and consequences.
From Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Doug Poppa, Truth and Consequences Podcast. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Sunday night, March 27th, 2022. The time is 22:44 hours Pacific time. That's 10:44 Pacific time. Listen, episode 102, go back and listen to that if you haven't already listened to it, because it'll put a lot of things into context that I'm talking about here in this episode. That was the episode about retired Undersheriff Kevin McMahill, who's running for sheriff, one of the candidates for sheriff. The other candidate that's running from the police department is retired Assistant Sheriff Tom Roberts, and then retired Sergeant Stan Hite. And I covered Tom Roberts in episode 104, and I covered Stan Hite in episode 103. Now I'm back to Kevin McMahill again. I said the other day that I have numerous documents, and I still get documents in, relating to the misconduct and the sustained charges of neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and untruthful during an internal affairs investigation. All those charges were sustained in 1995, like I said. So I have more documents I'm going to show here, exclusive to Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa. I don't believe anybody has seen these documents publicly yet. They will be shown for the first time here, I believe. And it's going to put into context why I say that former Las Vegas Metro Police Undersheriff Kevin McMahill is not fit for the office of Clark County, Nevada Sheriff, which would put him in charge, running commander of the Las Vegas Metro Police. Kevin McMahill is a documented liar many times over. Not by what I've proven, but by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Internal Affairs Bureau investigation in 1995. He is a documented liar. He is a pervert. He told Carrie Lance in 1995 to lift up her skirt and show him and Officer Stoops her vagina, which she did, and according to the police records, he did that and said, if you show me your vagina, I'll give you a bottle of wine back, which she did. She showed him vagina. He gave her the wine back. Officer Stoops, they found crack cocaine on her, told her if you don't want to go to jail, eat the crack cocaine. She did. The other officer that was there that did not participate in this, but she was there, was then Las Vegas Metro Police Officer Jennifer Clampett. Now, a lot of people said the other day after I did that podcast is that, well, she didn't intervene to stop it. And that's technically correct, but you're going to see here in this podcast why that was, okay? But the fact is, Jennifer Clampett is not running for Clark County Sheriff. William Stoops, the officer that was with them, that told Carrie Lance, eat the crack cocaine. He was fired later on, back in 1995, for a separate incident, and he's not running for Clark County Sheriff. Who we have running for Clark County Sheriff, one of the three candidates, like I said, is this guy, Kevin McMahill. Now, Kevin McMahill, like I said, is a documented liar. He is a pervert, and he has no business running for the office of Clark County, Nevada Sheriff. Like I said, if he wins that election, ladies and gentlemen, he'll be running the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And he continues to perpetrate the lie that he was investigated and clear of the charges. Now, I don't know what charges he's talking about, if he's sober when he's saying these things, but he was never cleared of those charges. Neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and truthfulness. He was deemed untruthful. He was deceptive on the polygraph. He failed the polygraph. I showed those documents in episode 102. So, on March 25th, the Las Vegas Police Protective Association posted a YouTube video on their YouTube channel, LVPPA, and it was interviews that they did, and I think that occurred on March 25th, the interviews. That's when it was posted. It was just a few days ago. And they interviewed Stan Hite, they interviewed Tom Roberts for about 20, 25 minutes, and then they gave over an hour to Kevin McMahill. Now, I want to play two video clips, excerpts from those interviews pertaining to Kevin McMahill. So bear with me 1 minute while I get that video up on the screen.
Well, I'm an Army veteran first. I grew up in Colorado, born in California. Went over, served a couple years in Korea, got out, and came back and started Metro in 1990. I was a patrol officer the vast majority of my career. Early on, as a sergeant, I did PSU and the academy, and then as a lieutenant, I had counterterrorism, saturation teams, regular patrol, narcotics.
Okay. He's responding to a question. The gentleman sitting on the left of him, the heavyset guy, that's Steve Grammas. He's the president of the LVPPA, the Las Vegas Police Protective Association. For those of you who don't know, is the union that represents the rank and file officers of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And there's another union that is the union for the Supervisors and Managers Association. That's not what this is. So he's responding to, tell us about your background. And I brought this up in episode 102. You just heard Kevin McMahill again say he got out of the military. He started on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department in 1990, and then he goes up how he was promoted over the years, sergeant and deputy chief and lieutenant and everything that he said. People, again, okay? He's not being truthful here. Just like I said in episode 102, if you remember in episode 102, from his own admission to retired Metro Police Sergeant Norm John in 2014, he told Norm John that he left the department for about 2 years, came back 2 years later. And his date of hire on the paperwork that we saw, reference to the investigation that they did on him and Stoops, shows his hire date is December 1994. So here again, he's saying he left the military. He started on Metro in 1990. He doesn't say anything about a break in service. He mentions nothing about his time on the Denver Police Department. And that's still, all that missing gap is still under investigation by me. When I say something's under investigation, that means I'm investigating it. Like the other day, I said I'll have more documents coming out that are continually going to prove that this man, Kevin McMahill, is lying every time he says he was investigated and cleared of the charges that I talked about in episode 102. So he's a liar. And he just lied again about his history, because he didn't say, I started on 1990 and I left for about 2 years and came back. He didn't explain why he had to leave and why he came back. He just says 1990 and all of a sudden I got promoted to sergeant and he's moving up the freaking ladder. So I just want to play that. Now, the next clip I'm going to play is an excerpt from that interview. I believe it was March 25th, a few days ago. And this time he brings up Tom Roberts, his opponent, the other opponent, the retired assistant sheriff. And you'll hear what he says. In essence, what he's going to say is that Tom Roberts is running a dirty campaign because he brought up, I'm assuming he's talking about the incident in 1995 when those charges against him were sustained. He was never cleared of those charges, okay? And you're going to hear him say, he's bringing them up, and all he says in this little excerpt you're going to see is that I was investigated and cleared. But the host of that interview, Gramis, and there's another gentleman sitting on the other side, he says, I was cleared of the incident, investigated and cleared. But he doesn't talk about what the freaking incident was. And Gramis didn't even ask him, well, can you explain to the membership of our union, in case they don't know, can you explain what the incident was that you are talking about, that you were investigated and cleared? But they don't. They completely ignore it and let him say what he said. And then he says something, you'll hear him say something like, it's all rumor and innuendo that Tom Roberts is talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, this man, Kevin McMahill, on that screen in that green shirt, okay, is a documented pathological liar. He continues to perpetrate a lie to not only the public and the press, but to the union members, the police officers on Metro, the rank and file police officers that he's addressing in this interview, because they have the elections coming up this week from Monday to Friday to see what the union membership are going to endorse for sheriff and for governor. He lied to the membership here. He is a liar, okay? It's not rumor and innuendo. I haven't seen the comments Tom Roberts making that he's alleging, okay? If indeed Tom Roberts did make comments, I haven't seen anything on social media yet where he made comments. But when he says it's all rumor and innuendo, and I was investigated and cleared, he's lying. He was not. He was investigated, and the charges were sustained when he told Carrie Lance to expose her vagina, and the other officer forced her to eat crack. He was sustained on those 3 charges: neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and being untruthful. One of the worst charges you can have leveled against you as a cop. And you're going to hear later on in this podcast a response I got from a retired high-ranking member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department who was aware of this investigation. You're going to see what he has to say, reference to Kevin McMahill. Okay? So I'm going to play this audio clip right now, and you're just going to hear what I just described.
As you know, there's a lot of negative attacks that Tom put out about me recently. There's nothing new here. It's unfortunate, though. I was hoping that we would have a clean campaign. I was hoping that we wouldn't have rumor and innuendo, and he knows fully well that I was investigated and cleared on that.
Okay. You just heard him say again, ladies and gentlemen, he knows, referring to Tom Roberts, I was investigated and cleared. Okay? He's not even describing what the hell he was investigated and cleared of. He was not. He was investigated. He was not cleared of those charges in 1995. And I'm going to have 2 documents, like I said, that I've never released before. They're exclusive to this podcast, Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa, that are further going to prove that he is a freaking liar. He was not cleared of these charges. Okay? Now, before we get to that, let's put this up on the screen here. And I'm going to read something. Now, okay, let me get me off the screen here for a second so you could see it, and I'll put me back up. Okay. I acquired this as I'm digging into doing my investigation going back 30 years. This is a Las Vegas Sun article that appeared in the newspaper. You can see up on the top, Tuesday, November 28th, 1995. Okay? That's up on the screen there. Before I get to that newspaper article, to put some things in context, let's go back and look at this document that I posted on episode 102. Okay. And it's going to put things into context what I'm talking about later in this podcast. That's the IA investigation, the Internal Affairs investigation, that says the charges were sustained against Kevin McMahill in 1995 when he was a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department patrol officer. Look at the bottom right-hand of that bottom right-hand side of the document that's on the screen, you see the top. It's a chain of command. It says Jerry Keller, Sheriff Keller. That's Sheriff Jerry Keller, who was a sheriff in 1995. Undersheriff Wingett. Then it goes to Deputy Chief McKee, which is McKee. And then under him, Captain Franks. That was Steve Franks, was the captain. And then under that, there's two lieutenants. One of them is Stavros Anthony, and there's another lieutenant. And then it's just Sergeant Hood. Sergeant Gary Hood was the squad supervisor for Clampett, McMahill, and Stoops when the incident happened in 1995. And we know Stavros Anthony was the lieutenant who wrote the letter to Jerry Keller that you can see here in a minute, recommending termination based on the results of the internal affairs investigation. And Lieutenant Stavros Anthony's supervisor at the time was Captain Steve Franks. Steve Franks' supervisor was Deputy Chief McKee. Deputy Chief McKee's supervisor was Undersheriff Wingett, and of course, Undersheriff works for the sheriff. At the time was Jerry Keller. Now, I just want to say something. If you remember from 103, episode 103 was the podcast I did on Stan Hite. If you didn't see it, go back and watch it because that's very interesting also. Remember, Stan Hite was the one that I asked, were you fired from the police department when you were a cop? And he had no choice but to say yes because he knew I already knew about it, okay? And he said yes. In 1993, like he said, you go back and look at it, he decided to have sex with a female in his police cruiser while he was working, and he got caught, and he was fired, okay? And if remember what he said, that he was fired and he got his job back thanks to Sheriff Jerry Keller and Undersheriff Wingett, because the incident with Stan Hite, keep this in your head for a minute, the incident with Hite, as he said, occurred in 1993, 2 years prior to the incident with McMahill and Stoops, which occurred in 1995. So Hite was fired. He gets his job back, and you heard him say, Wingett and Keller gave me a second chance, and he got his job back, and then he retired, 30 years of service, whatever he did. Go back on 103 if you want to watch it. The reason why I'm saying that is Kevin McMahill is still perpetrating this lie that he was investigated and cleared, okay? We know from episode 102, when I talked about it, we know he was never fired after he went to his pre-termination hearing in 1995. We don't know why they kept him. But if he thinks that because he got his job back, that cleared him, that's not what the pre-termination hearing does. They don't drop charges. The charges were sustained by the internal affairs investigation. When I read this article, you'll get a little clearer idea what happens at the pre-termination hearing. But I just want to bring that up is that, if he thinks, well, I kept my job because Sheriff Keller decided to let him stay on the department, this pervert, sexual deviant, they kept him on the department, and that's what he is, unless he has something to prove that he's not, and that's what he is to this day. Keller kept him on the department, and Keller also gave Stan Hite his job back because he said, we don't know. Keller and Wingett gave him a second chance, so that's why I want to get that up there. Now, I'm going to put one more document up on the screen. I showed this the other day, just to put some stuff in context here. Okay. Again, this is the letter, the memo that Stavros Anthony, see his signature on the bottom, Southeast Area Command, sent to Jerry Keller recommending termination for McMahill and Stoops in 1995. And you can read it on the screen. I read it in 102. Because the charges of neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and being untruthful and being deceptive on the polygraph, when Jennifer Clampett, Officer Clampett, at the time was the only one who passed the polygraph, she was truthful, he recommended termination to Jerry Keller. But Jerry Keller, for some reason, in his infinite wisdom, regardless of what the outcome was of that pre-termination hearing, because we don't know the exact results and have more papers coming in from that, is that McMahill stayed on the department. And then sometime later, William Stoops was fired for another incident. So I just want to put that in context over here. Now, let's go back to this. Take me off the screen for a minute so you can see it again. Okay. 2 cops accused by prostitute. Las Vegas Sun, Tuesday, November 28, 1995. Let me back up over here. Okay. I'm going to read. You're going to keep it up there. You can read it, sir. Not the whole article's not up there because it takes too much of the screen, but I'm going to read the article. It's 30 years old, and it was buried. And I got it from a source. Okay, now listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. 2 Metro police officers are on the brink of losing their jobs after allegedly forcing a Las Vegas woman to lift her skirt and let them sneak a peek. Officers William Stoops and Kevin McMahill have been accused of threatening to arrest 33-year-old Carrie Lance on drug charges unless she exposed herself to them during an August 1994 incident. Okay, now I'll explain something. They have that wrong here. They keep saying that the incident happened in August 1994 and a year later. I don't know why they said it. The journal article I'm going to put up on the screen says the same thing. I don't know why they're saying the incident happened in August 1994. It did not. That is incorrect. We know from the documents and people talk to me from my sources, the incident indeed happened in June of 1995. So that part of the article, they got the date wrong for some reason. I don't know. Then it goes on in the article. They, meaning McMahill and Stoops, also allegedly forced her to eat a piece of crack cocaine. Stoops and McMahill have been on paid administrative leave pending their pre-termination hearings. Stoops, 25, appeared before the 3-person panel Monday, which would have been November 27th of 1995. McMahill, 27, is scheduled for Wednesday, which would have been November 29th, 1995. Continuing with the story, the officers are being represented by the Police Protective Association's attorney. Spokesman David Crowell declined to comment on the allegations, but said, quote, they are fighting their actions, unquote. Now, here's what the article says. A pre-termination hearing is considered a personnel issue and unavailable to the public. In other words, it's private. The public has no right to find out what happened to their police officers that they're paying for with these pre-termination hearings. At least that's the way it was in 1995, and I still believe that's the way it is today. A Metro official, however, now listen to this, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said the officer's conduct has been called into question because of an incident involving a prostitute. And the police departments do this all the time, and the unions do this all the time on these investigations. All of a sudden, because the public is not supposed to be privy to what's going on in any of the details, but they come out and right away, they got to attack the victim, whether the victim, in this case, Carrie Lance, and they say because of an incident involving a prostitute. So right away, they're putting into the public's eye that because she was a prostitute, obviously, she can't be trusted, and she's pretty much a lower-level human being in their eyes than the police officers are. And this happens to this very day. You hear it all the time. The union or the police officials, somebody come out and say, an anonymous source within the police department said the victim has a 10-year record or was this and that. They do that to put in the public's eye to make them say negative against the person reporting the complaint or the victim, and to be positive for the police. So that's what they said over here, because of an incident involving a prostitute. Now, it goes on. Carrie Lance, who last week reached a $4,900 settlement with Metro, has been convicted of prostitution, said her attorney, Robert Cossack, and that's K-O-S-S-A-C-K. Upon her lawyer's urging, this is important, people, Lance filed a voluntary police statement on October 24th, 1995, accusing Stoops and McMahill of sexual assault, battery, and oppression under the color of office. Now, this is interesting, because I just saw this article today, okay? Remember the other day I said, why wasn't McMahill and Stoops, at the very least, charged with oppression under the color of law? And I gave some examples where other police officers in Metro were charged with that. As a matter of fact, in 1995, there were other officers for different things who were charged, and I think some of them were terminated, for oppression under the color of office. But in Stoops and McMahill's incident, they weren't. And that's going to, Let me finish reading the story. So let me read that again. Upon her lawyer's urging, Lance filed a voluntary police statement on October 24, 1995, accusing Stoops and McMahill of sexual assault, battery, and oppression under the color of law. We have no idea to this day what happened with that investigation, because indeed it was oppression under the color of law, battery, because they forced her, they touched her, I believe, to open up your mouth and everything, and then she's saying sexual assault, lift the skirt up. That's what our attorney wanted her to file, and that's what she filed. Now, listen to this. Again, this is coming from the Las Vegas Sun article that's up on the screen there. You see the top part of it. Metro is struggling to overcome an image sullied by allegedly brutal and corrupt police officers. Recently, 3 officers were fired and face criminal charges for allegedly beating and threatening to sodomize a man suspected of stealing coins from gamblers. They have pleaded not guilty. More class acts, more disgrace to the badge. Pre-termination boards consist of a deputy chief, captain, and civilian manager who listen to arguments presented by the police agency and, in most cases, an attorney for the accused officer. So according to this, and my sources told me this is pretty much correct to this day, on the pre-termination board, deputy chief, a captain, and a civilian manager who listen to the arguments between the attorneys, and it'll go on here for a minute. Okay, now continue. Within 3 days of the hearing, the panel must forward a recommendation to the sheriff, who will reject or accept the advice within 2 days. So once they come up with their determination whether somebody should be fired or remain on the department, that recommendation goes to the sheriff. At the time was Jerry Keller, and he can either accept it or reject it, which means he can either keep the officer or let him go. And in this case, we know that Kevin McMahill remained on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The story continues. Quote, "We should have something by Friday," Metro spokesman Greg McCurdy said. Okay, Greg McCurdy was a spokesman. I'm not going to get into Greg McCurdy, but he has a pretty bad history on the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department also. He's now retired, so maybe talk about that in another podcast. Okay, in this incident, Carrie Lance said she was standing on Commerce Street on 1 block north of Las Vegas Boulevard when a man approached her seeking drugs. When the man was denied drugs, he allegedly called 911 and reported that Lance needed assistance, according to Lance's voluntary police statement. So we know here that in the police files, and I'm going to try to get that, in that event number, they have a Metro voluntary statement from Carrie Lance. They obviously used that, remember, when Sergeant Tavares did the IAB investigation, and he confirmed in his investigation, he talked to Lance, he interviewed her, he talked to Clampett, did his investigation, and he confirmed, as I said in episode 102, that she corroborated the events as Jennifer Clampett, who made the complaint to IA, stated in her investigation. And remember, Jennifer Clampett took a polygraph, was truthful. Stoops and McMahill failed. They were deceptive. Okay. Then it goes on. 3 officers responded, Stoops, McMahill, and Officer Jennifer Clampett. Lance said she was searched by the 2 men, meaning Lance and Stoops, who discovered alcohol, a crack pipe, and 1 rock of crack cocaine. Lance said Stoops and McMahill told her that she could go to jail for possessing the cocaine and drug paraphernalia. Then they allegedly asked Lance to raise her skirt and spread her genitals while the male officers looked. Quoting, they're quoting now they're quoting now Carrie Lance. Feeling a deal was made, a sex show, not to go to jail, I asked for my pipe and rock back, Lance wrote, because now she exposed her vagina to them. She says, quote, they would not give it back. Instead, one of the male officers made me eat the rock, unquote. And that's according to a Metro Police voluntary statement. Quote, I told him it would burn my mouth, and it did burn my mouth. But the male officer made me eat it anyway and made me stick out my tongue a number of times to monitor my eating of the rock cocaine and to make sure I swallowed it, unquote. Cossack, her attorney, Carrie Lance's attorney, recommended that an incident report be filed because he says neither officer's actions have been forwarded to the Clark County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. I'm going to read that again because that's important. Cossack recommended that an incident report be filed because he says neither officer's actions have been forwarded to the Clark County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. So the Metropolitan Police Department, according to Carrie Lance's attorney in 1995, told the newspaper, the Las Vegas Sun, that none of the charges that were sustained by the Internal Affairs Bureau investigation were forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for possible criminal prosecution on Stoops and McMahill. Then it goes on to say, there is no record of criminal complaints filed against Stoops or McMahill, a Justice Court clerk said. The report said that the woman officer Clampett appeared to not know how to respond to the incident and did not participate. So saying Clampett didn't know what to do with these two guys who were taunting and terrorizing this woman and told her to show me your vagina, eat the crack, but it says Officer Clampett did not participate in any of that. A year later, it says, and again, they're making a mistake here, it's not a year later, it says Clampett allegedly reported the incident to Metro Internal Affairs offices. We know that's wrong because the incident happened through the documents we had, happened on June 10th, 1995. It was reported to Internal Affairs. They did the investigation starting in July. So I don't know why this one in the journal says a year later, so that's wrong. And then on the bottom it says, based on Clampett's report, Cossack said, Metro began investigating the incident in August 1995. It was actually, July 1995. So get rid of that paper. Okay. So this article here, take me off the screen a minute, is 30 years old, 1995, and that's what I just read into it. Now, put this on the screen. It's, again, 30-year-old article, so it's not looking too good. Okay, take me off the screen here for a minute. Okay, this is similar stuff in here. This is the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Again, the date on the story is November 28, 1995, and they have a picture of Stoops, as you can see, on his way or coming out of the pre-termination hearing. And just goes on. Pull that up over here. And basically it's the same thing in here. It says Stoops, they appeared, they go into pre-termination, and McCurdy made the comment. A settlement was reached for $4,900, and her attorney said the reason why I guess the settlement happened so fast is because he didn't think Carrie Lance would be able to sustain a lawsuit for 2 years. And you can read the article there on the screen, basically the same stuff. But this article also says, I don't know why they're saying the incident happened in August 1994. So maybe these two reporters just took each other's notes and ran with it. But the rest of the story, as far as we know, it's pretty much the same thing I just read in the Sun story. And the bottom part of that story that's not on the screen, same thing. It just goes on that somebody wanted to buy drugs from her, and she said no. The attorney said that they decided to tell her to eat the rock of cocaine, same thing that I just read on the other story. And then it goes on and says, the attorney said that a female police officer at the scene, Jennifer Clampett, came forward about a year after the incident. Here we go again with the year. It wasn't a year. It happened in 1995. He said the female officer was reprimanded for not reporting the conduct earlier. And I'm going to have something on that here in a minute, so trying to remember, Clampett's not running for sheriff, okay? But I'll straighten that out here in a second with some of the documents that I got that nobody's ever seen before, as far as I know. Now, it goes on. The Department's Internal Affairs Bureau on July 31st investigated a complaint made against Stoops and McMahill. Same thing, we already know that. Also filed against both officers were misconduct charges not based on the original complaint. Now, I originally said in episode 102 that I believe that those misconduct charges had to do something with the polygraph And my sources are telling me that that is not true. So there were other charges, I believe, that were filed against them that had nothing to do with the Lance complaint, and I'm still investigating that to find out what the hell is going on with that. And then it says police have not commented on specific charges. And then it says Cossack said he reached the settlement, meaning with Carrie Lance, that $4,900 settlement, because he expects the officers to be fired, clearing the way for the department to argue it is not legally liable for their conduct. Because if they fire them, they're going to say, well, we fired them because they violated policy. We're not liable in a civil suit because they violated policy. That's in essence what I believe is what he's saying. Let me read that again. Cossack, Carrie Lance's attorney, said he reached the settlement because he expects the officers to be fired, clearing the way for the department to argue it is not legally liable for their conduct. Quote, I really didn't think she, meaning Carrie Lance, would be able to stand 2 years of litigation, Cossack said. Okay, throw that one over there. Now, get back up on the screen here. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me say something. Carrie Lance straightened out her life. She got out of the life. She sobered up. She's lived a good life since, so she's a good person. And regardless of what she did in 1995 and what she was involved in, that's what we as a society want people to do when they're in that type of life. We want them to move on, and she was fortunate enough to move on and lead a good life after that. So just want to say it. She's not in the business. She's sober and everything like that. So what do we know from these things? Okay, we know that McMahill was never fired from the department. The attorney was concerned why the reports were not forwarded to the Clark County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. We know they weren't because McMahill was never arrested. He remained on the department. And why he remained on the department for all these years, and like I said, I think I said that in the podcast the other day, and you're going to hear what a retired high-ranking Metro official said to me, and I'll read his quote in a few minutes, is how can this guy work as a police officer when he was already sustained as being untruthful, a liar? Yet he stayed on the department, like I said, and he was never challenged, apparently, in any court case on that. Okay. Remember I said about what they said, that the attorney said they thought Clampett was brought up on charges? Let me put something on the screen, and this has never been made public, as far as I know. Let me get it up here. I think that's number 10. Here we go. Okay. Now, this is important. Okay. It's going to take me off for a minute. Not that part of it, what I'm reading here is anything, but that's the complaint on... Okay, this was an investigative report. It's the bottom part. The top of it just has names on it. And I guess they did investigate Officer Clampett for neglect of duty because, and it says in there, you can read it, she complied and released. All these events occurred in your presence and had no police purpose, because they're saying that she didn't take action, and I guess she allowed, saying Stoops and McMahill to do it. And that's a good point because people brought that up. But remember, Officer Clampett is not running for sheriff. And I'm going to clear up in a minute what happened with this, because I believe the charges were denied. And I'll read something from Captain Steve Franks, a document that's never been made public before. But the reason why I want to read this is because, again, in here, it says the charges against Stoops and McMahill were sustained and recommendation with termination. It says these events were reported, the bottom part underlined in red. That's my watermark on it. These events were reported by Officer Clampett to our supervisor, Sergeant Hood, on July 30th, 1995. An internal affairs investigation occurred, which culminated in a sustained complaint on both officers Stoops and McMahill with the recommendation for termination. So again, when McMahill says to this day that he was investigated and cleared, here's another document from 30 years ago that proves he is continually lying about this incident. He wasn't cleared of nothing. We already knew that from the other documents, but this is a new document that I acquired that nobody's ever seen before, And it says, again, they did an IB investigation. The charges were sustained. We know what those charges were, like I said, neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and untruthfulness because they were deceptive on the polygraph. And the only one that passed the polygraph and reported to the Internal Affairs Bureau was Officer Jennifer Clampett, who retired in 2008 at the rank of sergeant. So I'll take me off the screen here so you can see that. So that's that document from 1995. You can see the date on it, September 6, 1995. So what happened with this where they wanted to charge her with neglect of duty? Well, I'll put this up on the screen here, part of it. The whole thing's not up there because it didn't fit, but hang on one second. This is interesting. Again, don't believe anybody's ever seen this one before. Take me off the screen. Got my watermark on it. Okay. I'm going to take me off the screen there, and then I'm going to read it. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department memorandum. On the bottom it says confidential. That part of it's not on the screen. Memorandum dated September 13th, 1995. To Richard McKee, Deputy Chief. You remember that name, Richard McKee, okay? He's the chain of command. I talked about that before. This is from Steve Franks, then Captain Steve Franks. Subject, investigation, Jennifer Clampett, neglect of duty. So now let me get back on the screen because everybody screams when they don't see him anymore. I'll read the first line so you can see it. We have had several conversations reference initiating an investigation of complaint on Jennifer Clampett for neglect of duty. This violation stems from event number 950610-0712. In this event, so you can put up there, okay. In this event, Officer Kevin McMahill coerced a female into exposing her genital area in order to get her bottle of wine back. Officer Bill Stoops had this same woman eat a rock of cocaine to avoid being arrested for the charge. All of this occurred in front of Officer Clampett, and she did nothing. When Kevin McMahill opened his mouth and made his offer to the suspect, the overriding question is why didn't Officer Clampett interrupt this chain of events by saying something? Now, this is from Captain Steve Franks. In my 22 years, I've never seen anything like that. Now, here's what he has to say about this incident, and that was in the title of my podcast. He's never seen anything like it. He says, had I seen that, and I had heard Bill Stoops tell her to eat the rock of cocaine, I think the outrageousness of the previous, quote, cooperation, unquote, of the suspect would have caused me to act. Jennifer Clampett remained silent and did nothing to stop these events, much less prevent them. After this atrocious conduct, both Officers McMahill and Stoops turned to Officer Clampett and told her, quote, we got you now. If we go down, you go down. This scares her. This is Captain Steve Frank saying McMahill and Stoops' conduct and actions were atrocious. He's never seen anything like it. Doesn't say they were cleared of jack shit, okay? He said they were atrocious. And then that he relates that they turned around, in essence, threatened Officer Clampett. And he said, this scares her. He's writing this memo, Captain Steve Franks, to Deputy Chief at the time in 1995, Richard McKee. Let me continue. I'll just read that again. After this atrocious conduct, both Officers McMahill and Stoops turned to Officer Clampett and told her, quote, we got you now. If we go down, you go down. This scares her. If we take one person and interject a little bit of moral courage, that person being Jennifer Clampett, I doubt if either Officers McMahill or Stoops would have proceeded with their idiotic actions. Now he's calling it, besides atrocious, idiotic. Had she just stood up when Officer McMahill told the woman to lift her dress and said, quote, no, you don't have to do this. This stops. None of these events would have occurred, and we would not have two officers facing pre-termination and this embarrassment to our police department. So basically, In the front part of this, as you see on the screen, Steve Franks is telling Deputy Chief McKee that Clampett should have done something and she didn't. And but he thought the conduct of officers McMahill and Stoops were atrocious and idiotic, and it was an embarrassment to the police department. Okay? Now, the letter goes on at the bottom. There's some more stuff in here, and he goes on. He says, we have a duty to act. We have a duty to protect each other from harm and stupid actions. Officer Clampett had an excellent opportunity to demonstrate moral courage and leadership, and she failed. Okay. But now, after saying that, he explains this of why I believe no charges, and I believe no charges the charges were denied on her. It says, we, meaning him and the people he was talking to, Stavros Anthony, I guess, and all these people. Let me read it before I put words in anybody's mouth. We originally discussed violation of LVMPD policy 4/105-06, which states, members shall report all crimes, violations, emergencies, incidents, traffic congestion, or detours resulting from traffic accidents or other information of concern to the department that comes to their attention. Members, meaning police officers, receiving or processing facts which should be known to the department shall not conceal this information, but shall report the facts accurately through official channels. Then he goes on to say, this charge was rejected, the charge that they wanted to charge Stoops with, okay? And he says, as Lieutenant Anthony and I, along with your consent, believe she may have been frightened to report these incidents to her sergeant. Let me read that again. This is Steve Franks sending this memo to Deputy Chief Richard McGee, dated September 13th, 1995. He said that this charge, the one that I just read, was rejected as Lieutenant Anthony, that's Stavros Anthony, and I, along with your consent, believe she may have been frightened to report these incidents to her sergeant. As inconceivable as it is to me that a police officer could be so intimidated or frightened by their fellow officers that they would be moved to inaction boggles my mind. So that's what Steve Frank said. And as far as I know, I don't think the charges were sustained against a neglect of duty, but you'll hear from Jennifer Clampett down the road. I just went through these documents today and looked at them. But anyway, this really has nothing to do with Clampett now, because Jennifer Clampett is not running for sheriff. Who's running for sheriff is, get me off the screen here, put me back up over here. Okay, so here we are, ladies and gentlemen. It's Sunday night, 23:31 hours. It's 11:31. I want to make sure everything I covered in this podcast. So what did we learn from this podcast? We learned two more documents that say nothing that McMahill was cleared of anything. Reference to these charges. It reinforces and further corroborates the documents that I had on the screen, on the screenshots, and I discussed in episode 102 the other day. So we know now that when Kevin McMahill spews this lie about this incident and says he was investigated and cleared, he was never cleared. A matter of fact, Captain Steve Franks at the time called his actions and Stoops' actions atrocious and idiotic. He didn't say anything that they cleared. They went to a pre-termination board. A recommendation was given to Jerry Keller, whatever that recommendation was. Either way, Sheriff Jerry Keller in 1995 decided to keep Officer McMahill on this department, and Officer Stoops was later fired for another incident. I got a lot of stuff coming in, ladies and gentlemen, from police officers who were talking to me. Okay? Kevin McMahill is not the man that people think he is. Okay? He's not the man that should be running for the office of Clark County Sheriff. That would make him the leader of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. okay? This guy is a documented liar. He is a pervert, a sexual deviant, some people are calling him on the department, and that's what he is. There's also allegations, and I discussed this the other day, okay? There's allegations of at least 2 extramarital affairs by Kevin McMahill with females on the police department. One was in the detective bureau at the time, who for some reason for years has gotten every transfer that she ever put in for, and another person moved up in rank, I think the captain or deputy chief. That's what I'm being told from my sources. There's more coming on Kevin McMahill because he was also brought up on charges of using derogatory terms as camel toes, cunt, and snail trail. And I'm going to explain that in a separate podcast because I don't want this thing to go on very long. We're at 49 minutes. So, and there's other stuff. Kevin McMahill, like I said, was complicit in every cover-up with Sheriff Lombardo. More cover-ups involving Lombardo and McMahill that I will be exposing. Before I go, okay, this is what a retired, high-ranking Las Vegas Metro Police official told me. These are his words. He was on the department when the McMahill and Stoops incident occurred. Everybody talked about it. It was all over the department. He says, I was on the department because he was much younger at the time, and when they made the comment to the female to show her vagina. I can attest that what you reported regarding this event, meeting my podcast, did in fact occur, and it was discussed openly throughout the station, meaning the area command, the substation. Both McMahill and Stoops should have gone to prison for what they did. And if it occurred in today's time, they rightfully would have. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not my words. These are the exact words coming from a retired high-ranking member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. He goes on, during the accompanying internal investigation surrounding this incident, Kevin McMahill lied and was found deceptive after being given a polygraph exam. And I brought that out in episode 102. McMahill should have been immediately placed on the district attorney's, quote, Brady list, and should have never been allowed to hold the position of a police officer again. Remember, I spoke about Brady Giglio. That's basically if an officer is deemed untruthful, which Kevin McMahill was by his own police department, basically you're done as a cop because you can't make arrests, because you can't testify, because your integrity, your character, it'll be compromised. But he remained on the department, and we don't know why, okay? Now he goes on to say, in fact, McMahill cannot be hired for the position of a police officer in many states due to the issue of being sustained for untruthfulness. This from a high-ranking member of the department. This is unacceptable and again discredits all of us in our profession who have integrity. He should be disqualified to even run for the office of sheriff. If McMahill wins the election, how can he hold others accountable for lying if he has been factually identified as a proven liar? Good point. How will this affect future lawsuits against the LVMPD? And then his last paragraph. If I was suing the department for anything, I would personally subpoena the sheriff and outline the failed polygraph test to set the ground for a culture of deception and misconduct. Ladies and gentlemen, those are not my words. Those are the words of a retired, high-ranking member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And people say, well, why did these people just come out and you always say, they hide behind anonymity, and I'll tell you some people, and I'll tell you why. A lot of these people who spend time on the police department, high-ranking, lower rank, no rank, just police officers, they retire. They have family members who are either sworn or civilian members of the police department. They have family members who work in the Clark County District Attorney's Office. They have family members who work in the 8th Judicial District Court or the Las Vegas Justice Court. they have family members, in essence, in the criminal justice system, okay? And they're afraid of retaliation because we know retaliation occurs. Now, this retired high-ranking official, when he said, how can he become sheriff? Well, I would take it and then, how can he question anybody else's integrity and lying? But ladies and gentlemen, I have documents. It's unbelievable the stuff that I got over the period, a couple of years here. But the sources who spoke to me said during his tenure as undersheriff, Kevin McMahill's name is on termination papers and disciplinary record for people who were suspended for a lot less than the charges that were stained against him. And now he's running and campaigning. He speaks in front of the union of the day and says he was cleared without explaining what the charges were. He was never cleared, people. This guy is a freaking liar. He's a pervert. It's amazing that he spent 30 years on the department. But his character never changed. He never stood up for anything against Lombardo and all these cover-ups and said, I'm not being involved. He was involved with all those cover-ups that I talked about the other day and many more that are on my website, Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa. I exposed these cover-ups. He was on the department. He was the number 2 person. He basically ran the show. That's what he was doing. So he needs to be held accountable. And putting this man in charge by electing him sheriff of Clark County, it's a freaking joke. It's a freaking joke. It's very, very, very sad. Okay, I think I covered everything. I don't have anything left here in my notes for this podcast. This sheriff's race is, people, you vote who you want. I have no power to tell anybody not to vote. It's a free country. You want to vote for this pervert, this liar, vote for him, okay? But I said the other day, the only person I think that is qualified to be the sheriff of Clark County, because I can't find nothing in his background that's contradictory in his integrity or character, is retired Assistant Sheriff Tom Roberts, okay? Because he only went up to the rank of Assistant Sheriff. He wasn't running the whole department like Kevin McMahill was. Basically the sheriff, but the number 2, the undersheriff, runs the department, okay? We have to break, for the sake of the police officers on this department, okay, who are sick and tired of the BS, like I said, the corruption, the misconduct, good cops getting screwed, while other cops get away with DUI and domestic violence and other crimes, and other cops lose their job, and some of them keep their job. I mean, it's a freaking disgrace. To break the circle, we have to break the circle of where an incumbent sheriff, like now, Sheriff Lombardo, is supporting his number 2, Kevin McMahill, who's getting all this money from the casino industry and these businesses, just like has been going on, like I said, for 10 years. Jerry Keller was a sheriff. He endorsed Bill Young. Bill Young became sheriff. He didn't want to run anymore. He endorsed Doug Gillespie. Doug Gillespie became sheriff. He didn't want to run anymore. He endorsed Joe Lombardo. Joe Lombardo's not running because he's running for governor, and that's a freaking disgrace too, because Joe Lombardo is a corrupt, incompetent, lying piece of crap, okay? So, and this guy may make governor. Matter of fact, somebody said the other day, and the guy's making a joke, he said, you're really destroying Lombardo, but, he has all the qualifications for being governor, just like you said. He's corrupt, he's incompetent, and he's a liar. Good point, okay? So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this episode. It's Sunday night from Las Vegas, Nevada, 23:41 hours. That is 11:41 p.m. Pacific time. This is Doug Poppa, Truth and Consequences podcast. Remember, subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting the red button. If you can, support my independent investigative journalism. PayPal.me/Doug Poppa. Audio podcasts, as I keep saying, and they're audio podcasts. You want to see the video. Spotify, Radio Public, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts. There's a whole bunch of slews. Some of the older ones are on Spreaker. So you got the audio. Listen, I got much more stuff coming out that you will not see on the Las Vegas media reporting on. And I just wish, and I get all these emails that come in and saying, Doug, you've broken one major story after another, and none of them have ever been followed up by the Vegas media. I said, I can't answer that question because I don't work for the Las Vegas media. You know, people are real pissed off about Sheriff Lombardo's cover-up of the incompetence and negligence in 2018 that led to the rape and kidnapping of a 12-year-old girl in 2019. People are highly pissed about that, and they can't for the life of me. And people all over the country read my stories, and people like from New York, these guys said, Doug, if this happened in New York, this would be on the front page of the Daily News or the Post until they got an answer. How is it that we don't see any of your stuff being followed up on the Vegas media? I said, I don't know. I can't explain that. I don't work for the Las Vegas media, you know, but that's what it is. And people read my stuff, and it's out there. But I'm telling you, people, Kevin McMahill is a documented liar, at the very least, a pervert. He has no business running for Clark County Sheriff. And things are only going to get progressively worse because I have more people talking to me, and I got more stuff on Kevin McMahill that's going to come out in future podcasts. And Joe Lombardo, the same thing. More cover-ups that Joe Lombardo and Kevin McMahill kept from the public, some of it involving the Las Vegas massacre. Everybody knows I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I actually debunked conspiracies, some of the conspiracy theories when I was writing the stories on the massacre. I saw all the crazy stuff, all the photographs people were sending me that turned out to be nonsense, people saying they were, you know, how disgraceful they could have been, these people, back years ago when they were saying they were crisis actors and they were dummies laying there. What a freaking disgrace. I hammered all of them. You know, the Mossad jumping in and out of the planes, guns coming from gun shops, rounds coming from gunships, people rappelling down into the room to get Paddock out, all this bullshit. Stephen Paddock, ladies and gentlemen, and I've said this in multiple stories on this podcast, was the only person in that room when the rounds were being fired out that window. Okay? He was. And I'm telling you, if he wasn't, with all the stories that I did and I broke with my sources, don't you think, and I was really looking for something to say there's got to be a bigger picture here? The bigger picture is not the biggest the bigger picture is the incompetence and the negligence for years, both with MGM Resorts International and the police department, but not being prepared. You know, Joe Lombardo wants to be governor, but in his own after-action review, they stayed in there. After all the years, and I explained this in podcast, and I documented this, of being put on notice by the FBI, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security that I worked for a year, okay? All these years that was going on, a possible threat, possible terrorist attack, single lone shooters, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, under command of Sheriff Joe Lombardo, and his undersheriff, Kevin McMahill, who was also undersheriff for a couple months with Gillespie, but then he was deputy chief before that, they did not have a mass casualty incident plan in place the night of the Las Vegas massacre. And that is a freaking disgrace. And this incompetent guy, Lombardo, thinks he's capable and competent enough to run the entire state of Nevada. 58 people died that night. 2 more died later on from wounds. Almost 500 people wounded. There were some great police officers out there that did some great work that night, but we also had a lot of them that didn't do too good. And one of them was called El Hendricks, and I was one of the first ones to report that story. And if you think he was the only one that didn't act that night, yeah, he was the only one because I exposed it, and then other people hit on the story. But McMahill and Lombardo concealed other officers that didn't act the way they should have acted that night. They conceal that. That's another thing. And another thing I got come out is the leaking of the photographs. Okay, I got all these stories coming out. There's just so much stuff that I got to get out. But anyway, it's 23:46. Getting a little tired. It's almost midnight out here in the desert. And March 27, 2022. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned, because what you hear on here, you will not hear from the Las Vegas media. Thanks again for listening. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody have a good night.